Dear viewers, thank you for joining us. You are watching OBN Horn of Africa. This is our weekly show, Talk to OBN. Today we're going to discuss about the ongoing situation in Ethiopia. Here in a studio, I'm joined by an independent journalist from U.S., Ann Garrison. Thank you for joining me.
You're most welcome. Thank you for having me.
Welcome to Ethiopia and welcome to OBN as well.
Thank you.
All right. Is that your first time to be here?
Yes, it is.
Ethiopia?
Yes.
So, can you tell us about your observation, and does that exactly goes with what you have heard about Ethiopia before?
What I notice here in Addis is that there's a building boom. During the week there's constant sound of construction, one high-rise after another going up, and if I weren't watching TV, I would not know that there was a war going on. But the first thing I did before coming to Addis was to go to Lalibela, where they still have no water or electricity. Well, they have water, they have no plumbing, no electricity. No plumbing because they have no electricity. They have no electricity like all 9 cities on that route that goes through Sokoto and Lalibela from Alamada. And that is because the power line that begins at the substation in Alamada has gone out. And since I couldn't go to Alamada, it's in Tigray, and it's in the control of the TPLF. I don't know what was done there. People in Lalibela told me that they had blown up the substation. That seemed like it would have been like shooting themselves in the foot, but I don't know whether they did that or not. They might have just disabled the transmission line that goes all along that highway, or road, whatever you call it. And so the first thing I saw when I got into Lalibela was a lot of people walking down the road with jerry cans. They were on their way to streams or water tanks to get water. And the water tanks were only being filled every 3 days, so what they could get would have to last for 3 days from a water tank. They were going to streams also, but the stream flow was very low because it's the dry season. I stayed in a hotel where there was electricity only from 7 to 10 p.m. at night. That's because they had a generator there. The only electricity was powered by generators. One thing I saw was people grinding grain in the traditional way with stone, because the mills that had been operated by electricity were shut down. There was one operating with a generator. In Lalibela, the economy had been devastated because it totally depends on the tourism, the people who come to see the churches. Beautiful, beautiful holy place too. I mean, just the setting up in the mountains, you can see why King Lalibela built the churches there. It's very spiritual.
Great, okay, Lalibela has been under the control of TPLF before 2 months. And can you tell us about the casualties and displacement, all the atrocities made by TPLF?
Okay, before I go into the casualties and atrocities, let me finish that the people of Lalibela were suffering because the economy had suffered so bad, because first there was COVID and the tourists stopped coming, and then the TPLF occupied. And that made everyone suffer because there was no work. And people are still suffering, the tourists are beginning to come back, but people have been suffering since the beginning of the epidemic. And they told us that it was very harsh when the TPLF were there. People were frightened. They hid in their homes. They cooked at night, late at night, because they were afraid that if they were cooking during the day, the TPLF would knock on the door and demand their food. However, and there were people who were killed. People said they'd seen citizens killed in the streets by the TPLF. They said that sometimes children came to the door, and the TPLF had sent them, and they came to the door asking for food, and people would be confused because they knew that they were TPLF child soldiers, but their religion told them that they should give food to children. We went on, the other thing about Lalibela, I forgot. That in Lalibela, both the TPLF and the ENDF had agreed not to do any fighting around the churches, so as not to damage the churches. They had negotiated with the priests, and so the fighting took place around the city. Nevertheless, the city was for a time occupied by the TPLF. And hotel. There were no hotels damaged, although there were others that I was told belonged to members of the TPLF or TPLF sympathizers, and those were undamaged. But we saw a lot of hotels that were damaged, and again, the lifeblood here is tourism. And there was one hotel that had been occupied by TPLF officers, and it had been the site of a surgical drone strike. I didn't think that such a thing was possible, but it had actually been hit, and the building had been badly destroyed, and there were, it wasn't pretty. There were still large blood stains where the officers had died, but as I understood it, as it was told to me, that was the end of the occupation of Lalibela. After that, the TPLF left. Okay, we went on from Lalibela to Soqueta. In Soqueta, there were 3 miserable internally displaced persons camps. Each one was worse than the other. The first one we saw was bad, the next one we saw was worse. The last one we saw was just absolutely, well, they were all abysmal, but they got worse each time. There was inadequate food, water, and medicine in all 3. In the first one, some people had mattresses to sleep on. People seemed to be cooking indoors, like inside I think they were tents put up by the UNHCR. But they were cooking indoors right where they were living. Not everyone had mattresses, but some people had thin mattresses. In the second one, even more people, probably 1,000 people, I'd say, were packed into one big tent. There were no mattresses at all. And again, not enough food, water, medicine. And it particularly hurt me to talk to a number of elderly women who looked really, really thin, way too thin, and said they'd lost everything. People told us over and over that the TPLF had taken everything they had.
The US government is still treating TPLF as acting as if TPLF's godfather and accusing Ethiopian federal government instead. And you've been following the incident from the get-go, and I have been hosting you via Zoom so far, and now you physically appeared in some parts of Ethiopia where the casualties and war had been taking place. What do you like to tell to the US government? Maybe how do you tell the reality that exactly happened there? Why the US government always denounce the federal government and favor TPLF while all those happenings are enacted by TPLF?
Because TPLF is their chosen winner, and so they identify TPLF and the Tigrayan people as worthy victims. The people that we saw in Lalibela, who are Amhara and I believe Ago people, who are a subset of Amhara. I can't claim to understand that very well, but that was how it was explained to me. They are not the victims that the U.S. is interested in. I'm sure that there's plenty of suffering going on in Tigray. Who's actually causing it? I'm not sure that that's not the TPLF itself. And we did see a camp where Tigrayans had fled Tigray, south on the A2 into Amhara region. The United States has presented the TPLF as the victims all along, even though anyone who paid attention to this knew that this began when the TPLF attacked 5 bases in the Northern Command in Tigray. But very soon the US narrative became that the war started when Prime Minister Abiy sent troops into Tigray. As though he had used the attack on the alleged attack on the Northern Command as an excuse. So right away the US narrative became that the TPLF were victims and the government of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed was the aggressor.
Okay, another question. World Food Program has chosen Ethiopia as its board member, and what does this imply? Like, they've been accusing the Ethiopian federal government for not giving access to humanitarian activities in Tigray. Is there a paradigm shift, or is there a kind of negotiation between the U.S. government and Ethiopian government, do you think?
Oh, about the unfettered access?
Yes.
Well, sure, they're talking about it every day, I think, for the past 2 years. Every time there's been a report in the Western press for the past 2 years, almost every day, 9 times out of 10, it has talked about the need for unfettered access, the demand for unfettered humanitarian access. Well, that's an unreasonable demand in a war. You can't expect one party to a war, in this case, the Ethiopian National Defense Force, to simply let trucks roll in to a war zone without knowing what's inside of them. It's only reasonable for the Ethiopian government to demand to check what's in the trucks. Because once a war has started, both sides have to be resupplied with munitions. Where are the munitions that are being supplied to the TPLF coming from? I know I've been told that they buried a lot of weaponry, that they buried it on the side of roads, but this has been going on for 2 years. You can't keep fighting a war for 2 years without being resupplied with both food and munitions. So where are these coming from? Are the food trucks not making it possible for the TPLF to be able to continue the war? They have to eat. Where is that aid going? And where are the munitions coming from? I mean, they have to come either, they have to come by trucks, or they could come by airlift, or perhaps they could come from Sudan if that border were open. I don't know how porous that border is right now. Or they could come from a violation of Ethiopian airspace from across the border. Now, I don't know, but when you talk about the trucks and the unfettered access, you also have to ask who's resupplying the TPLF, because it's only reasonable that the government check the trucks to see what's inside. But I'm all for humanitarian access. Also, there was not enough humanitarian access in the camps in Sokoto or the camps near Woldia in Wollo that we visited. I was traveling with the photographer Jamal Countess and with Shiba Tekeste of Push Start Studios. So go ahead. I actually want to go to. I want to go to where the World Food Program headquarters is here in Addis, and see if they'll talk to me about this. I found the road that they're headquartered on. As
you have said, the federal government has undergone unfettered humanitarian access to Tigray. Very recently, about 50 trucks arrived to Tigray, and this action has been appreciated by the U.S. And it's a good move. They've said that. In the meantime, the U.S. government has been accusing the federal government for committing genocide, crime against humanity, and other related issues on the allegation of HR 6600. What does this show? Is there, a kind of change from the U.S. side to cancel that allegation, because they have been asking for this unfettered humanitarian access and to sit for national dialogue? Even TPLF this last week pulled out its troop from Afar. So is there a kind of agreement, or is there understanding between the federal government and U.S. to have tabling what they have been requesting so far?
I'm not sure about that. There are two issues now with the food aid. One is that suddenly all the food aid has been going in an enormous outpouring to Ukraine. And since it's Western governments that provide most food aid, there are big shortages for Yemen, Afghanistan, Ethiopia, Syria. This has been widely reported. I don't think when there's so much less aid available, the argument about unfettered access is weakened. I've never thought that the unfettered access argument was strong anyway, because it's only reasonable, as I said, for the government to ask to check the trucks to see what's in them and to stop them if there are weapons in them.
What's your thought on the HR 6600 though?
I think it's horrible, and I think it needs to be defeated, and I know a lot of people working hard to defeat it. Right now it just seems to be on hold, but the U.S. government issued that HR 6600 is suspended for a while. I need you to tell me the reason of suspension. In the meantime, your thought is about this allegation. Well, it's on the House floor. In our process, it passed out of the Foreign Relations Committee onto the House floor. When you say it's suspended, it's not exactly suspended. I think it's just not likely to come. No one's pushing for it, or not enough people are pushing for it to come to the House floor for a vote right now. And that's in part, I believe, because it's hard for anyone to think about anything but Ukraine. I mean, there can be some benefits to that kind of distraction because it gives those working to defeat 6600 enough time to organize. But as for 6600, it's a horrible bill. It would establish the kind of economic strangulation that sanctions typically cause, ending World Bank and IMF loans and/or aid, and bilateral aid and loan agreements between Western nations and Ethiopia. Whether you're better off without these things is a question, because for one thing, Eritrea has been able to survive without them and maintain their independence. Several other things it does is call for international justice and prosecution of the perpetrators and identification of who the perpetrators are. Well, it's typical that the U.S. and their allies and the Western foreign policy establishment, the NATO nations, want to identify and prosecute the guilty and take them to the International Criminal Court or whatever ad hoc criminal court they've created, International Criminal Court like the ICTR or the ICTY. And it's imperial justice.
Okay, great. So
oh, wait, the other thing is the limitation of social media.
Okay.
Like you and I probably found one another via social media, and it wants to limit discourse about Ethiopia on social media. I mean, that's really scary.
Okay, thank you. So what is your anticipation about this HR 6600? Is the U.S. government going to impose or cancel it once and for all?
Well, first, there's also a Senate bill one should keep in mind, Senate Bill 3199, which is more or less the same. It would have a little more effect because it would be an actual act rather than a resolution. But they're more or less the same. And if they pass both the House and the Senate, then it's a real problem. But I think that the U.S. government is using that as a bargaining chip. He's talking to Prime Minister Abiy and the government and saying, give us this, this, and that, and we won't pass the sanctions. If you don't, we'll pass the sanctions. At the same time, you have communities pressing hard, especially the diaspora. The Ethiopian diaspora is the best organized diaspora I've ever seen. And they are pressing hard to keep those bills from passing. And they're very politically active, very active in electoral politics.
Okay.
They've even got a candidate.
Okay. Regarding the allegation, among others, the U.S. government need Ethiopian government to just entertain peace, stability, and democracy. And the bill is all about to have this in Ethiopia.
That's baloney.
In the meantime, the allegation is due to a genocide, crime against humanity happened in Ethiopia, and the UN is about to send 3 impartial investigators, and you as an independent journalist, you've been investigating and observing what had happened there in Lalibela and Sokoto, right?
Right.
What ought to be done from the side of Ethiopian government? Should the government allow these 3 impartial investigators to come and investigate what had happened there? Because I personally have a fear, because these impartial investigators are a lapdog of US one way or another. For example, a girl from Gambia and one from Kenya and the US. These people participated in the case of Rwandan genocide for this Gambian woman. So shall we trust them? Are they really impartial? Can we say that?
Are these the investigators from the UN Human Rights Council or from the International Criminal Court?
From the UN.
From the UN Human Rights Council. Okay, well, there's already been one investigation. I read it by the UN Office of the Commissioner of Human Rights and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission. Okay, and it indicated that there had been atrocities on both sides. It did not say that there had been a genocide. Cannot remember whether it used the term crimes against humanity, but in any case, it said that there had been crimes on both sides. So I'm not sure why the Human Rights Council wants another investigation. To me, this seems like another sort of threat. If we don't get what we want, we're going to threaten you with a human rights investigation, and possibly then the threat that's always behind that is indictments in the International Criminal Court or some other ad hoc criminal court that may be created. Any investigators should also go to the IDP camps around Lakota and on the A2 highway. There are IDP camps all up and down the A2 highway, including the one that I mentioned for Tigrayan IDPs. And the complaint that the government is not delivering electricity and opening banking services and so forth, I find that really, really doubtful. I mean, they couldn't instantly restore the electricity in Lalibela or the other cities along that corridor where the transmission line was put out. Restoring electricity is a big infrastructural project. If your substation is damaged, you have to rebuild another substation. If your lines are down, you have to rebuild them. They haven't been able to do that yet. They haven't had the resources or whatever to do it along that corridor that goes through Lalibela. So I don't think one should assume that the government is doing this for other parts of Ethiopia that are suffering, but withholding it from Tigray.
Okay, you've been to Lalibela and Sokoto, and that place had been under siege before a couple of months, obviously. And can you tell me the current peace and security status of that specific province there?
The region? My experience was that there were soldiers at a number of points along the road, and sometimes they would ask for our passports. We weren't troubled in other ways, but I think it was obvious that we were American journalists. In Sokoto, we went past a college that had been converted into the regional command base there, the regional command base of the ENDF. We did not see any TPLF soldiers, but the people who had fled to Sokoto from the northernmost regions said that they had fled from the TPLF. So it would seem that the TPLF is still inside the northernmost regions of Amhara. because these people didn't feel like they could go home. They said they wanted peace, they wanted to go home. They wanted to go home to whatever was left there. But they couldn't so long as the TPLF was there.
You haven't got any affiliation to any media press, and you do have a free mind to tell the reality to the global world and what happened in the northern part of Ethiopia, particularly in Wallo, talking specific place, Lalibela and Sokoto.
Right.
I mean, can you comprehend all the happenings there and tell to the global audiences?
Well, I do have media associations. It's just that my media associations don't have any corporate or state funding. They're all funded by listeners and readers. I produce radio for the Pacifica Radio Network, and I produced a piece that's airing now this week about something we haven't talked about. It's just the discovery of mass graves in underground prisons in the area north of Gondar, in Wolkait, Temsk, Tikeri. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing those three areas right, but I went there. I went to the press conference at the University of Gondar, and the journalists I was traveling with went out along the trail through the canyons and cliffs where the mass graves and underground prisons were uncovered. I produced a piece about that for the Pacifica Radio Network this week, and I wrote a piece last night for the Black Agenda Report about my observations here in Addis Ababa. Those are the two outlets that I have most affiliation with, the Pacifica Radio Network and Black Agenda Report, where I'm a contributing editor. I've written quite a bit during the past 2 years, well, a year and a half since the war started, for the Black Agenda Report about this. And yes, I will go back and I've been writing and reporting from here, and I will go back and explain whatever I've been able to understand by the time I leave. I think that my traveling companion and I are going to go to Afar, and then I'm going to go to Eritrea for a bit.
There will be a national dialogue which embraces all stakeholders. And how do you see this ambition? Would it be a lasting solution for Ethiopia?
Oh, well, it's not for me. It's not for me to say any more than it's for the U.S. to say. You ask about negotiating with the TPLF, which means for them negotiating with the U.S. And the U.S. insists negotiate with the TPLF, negotiate with us. It's not their business. Of course, this is the U.S. intruding in other people's business, other people's self-determination, just like they always do. And I oppose it just like I always do, just like the publications and the radio stations that I work for always do. We can do that because we don't have any state or corporate funding. We're only supported by listeners and readers. It's not for me, just as not for the U.S. to say how you should solve your problems or how the national dialogue could work out, but I will say one thing about that. In the conversation that I had with the woman Ethiopian-American woman who went off into the canyons and cliffs where the underground prisons and mass graves had been discovered, she said to me, well, I referred to her as Amharian, and she said, I'm not Amharian, I'm an Ethiopian, in this case an Ethiopian American who speaks Amharic. And that's the kind of significance she'd like to see put on citizen, and many people have told me this, that they want their Ethiopian citizenship to be more important than their ethnic identity or language. So I would love to hear that from other people. I'm an Ethiopian and I speak Tigrinya, or I'm an Ethiopian and I speak Oromo.
Let me ask you this. The government, since the reform came into play, into a new chapter, to have another Ethiopia which is known for hunger and displacement, food insecurity, and still trying a lot, meaning then the incumbent leadership. How do you see all the moves starting from day one up until these days?
Well, I admire Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's industrial ambitions. The other day, I watched his speech on TV. Of course, I couldn't understand it because it was in Amharic, but afterwards I read about it. I read about it in English translation, and he was emphasizing wanting Ethiopia to become a wheat exporter. And someone else close to the government whom I talked to said yes, that he wanted Ethiopia to be cereal independent, to produce all its own cereals. And I had the honor of having a conversation with Bilene Seyoum, and we talked about food security. Also, she said that that was one of the government's primary goals, food security. That is like the first step towards independence, not having to rely on food aid. I think that, I think that Prime Minister Abiy is very committed to all the possibilities that the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam brings to make Ethiopia a real powerhouse. I mean, electricity throughout the country, that solves the biggest problem that most one of the biggest problems that most African nations have, which is electricity poverty. So that's a whole new game that makes all kinds of industrial possibilities possible.
Angarison, an independent journalist, thank you for making time to share us this and your observation that you undergone in northern part of Ethiopia. Once again, thank you very much on behalf of this media house.
Thank you for having me.
Okay. Dear viewers, thank you for watching. This brings you to the end of our edition for today. See you next time with another edition. Bye-bye. Take care.